joining us today on Lattes with Leaders.
I'm Zainab.
And I'm Trisha. And we're excited for you to join us as we catch up over coffee with CEOs and executives from diverse backgrounds and industries.
We seek to discover what is unique about each leader and educate you guys on new and interesting topics. Our conversations seek to enlighten and inspire people from around the world to realise that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things.
There are corporate cultures that are toxic. But when I look at the corporate culture, I think a lot of the time we say, well, what's the company doing about it? But what are we doing about it? That toxic culture doesn't exist if every individual in that team and organisation called out what they saw, called out misogyny or bad behaviour.
In this episode, we speak with Simone Clarke, the CEO of UN Women Australia, with over 25 years experience working in not-for-profit leadership with a particular focus on empowering women and children. We're excited to chat with Simone about careers in the UN, the concept of unconscious bias, and fostering psychological safety at work. Note that with the recent Roe versus Wade ruling, we start our conversation on this topic and its implications on women's rights.
It's been a really difficult week mentally, I think, for a lot of people. But definitely I've been still trying to overcome my own thinking on it. Like normally I kind of post a lot of this stuff on social media and I haven't even done that this time because I feel like I'm too angry to actually talk about it, to be honest.
Yes, well, it's a bit. I think it brings out a lot of emotions, and there's quite a spectrum. And yes, I think that's. At first, I was very much looking at what was unfolding, and anger, shock, dismay, sadness, and then anger again, and then. But how do I channel that into something meaningful, as opposed to feeling like I'm jumping on the social media bandwagon, for want of a better description? Not that that's what it is, but it's just. And what voices, and the chorus of voices, and then also just watching, particularly when we're sitting in Australia and looking at what's happening in another country, and so people are incensed about it, and then it's like, okay, well then also we need to also look at what's happening in Australia. So and we're by no means perfect. We haven't got the same level of repeal of a long-held law, but we've still got some work to do in that space ourselves. So it's just one of those unfortunate, and I think it's also, I think what scares people on a broader scale is that, it's more, I think, challenging is the concern around this being the sort of, the start or the tipping point for a whole lot of regressive social policy in the States and beyond. And it's certainly something that we've had experience of with our own, recent Prime Minister, although we've had a recent change of government. So, yeah, I think it's, and also, makeup of the Supreme Court and all those things. And so it's just, I think it's probably a very challenging time on a number of levels, but on a fundamental human rights level, I think it's really, this is about reproductive rights and women. But, I think the conversations are obviously turning to, well, what's next? And will it be same-sex marriage and all the other things that have been recent gains? It's disappointing. It's just disappointing and just regressive and foul, really.
We'd just like to take a minute to welcome you to Lattes with Leaders, Simone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast. I am obviously in awe of everything that you're doing, and it's definitely right up my street. So I feel like I might fangirl you in this episode. I think the first thing that I found that really jumped out at me, Simone, about you was really around having this very dynamic career, because you've stepped into different kind of organizations over the years that you've been working, and now you're in an extremely senior role as CEO of UN Women Australia. I'd love to know a little bit more about kind of what a career in the UN looks like. How do you even go about developing something like that? And what it actually means to work for the United Nations.
No problems at all. in terms of career path, in terms of the United Nations system, and certainly my experience and what's led me to be where I am today, quite frankly, is a very probably unorthodox career path, having covered various different areas from marketing to communications to sustainability. But in terms of the UN in particular, I don't know that I necessarily have a silver bullet for how to start working in the UN. I've just had the absolute privilege to be able to do that. And I think probably some of the diversity in my previous roles assisted me in that. But I think in terms of the UN, there are probably a few different entry points. Obviously, the United Nations are headquartered in New York. There are various different ways through a traditional route. Individuals can apply for roles within the UN. As you imagine, they are fairly competitive. But the UN system also has a number of national committees and national organisations in country. So I think if people are interested in working for the UN in a global role, it's a really good starting point to look at what is the UN doing or what agencies are actually present in your own country, and then perhaps start with those and see the work that they are doing. So, and again, I think it's one of those things where different roles will come up at different times, but I think the more depth of experience and diversity of experience that you can bring to a role, the better. Having said that, there are people with exceptionally strong legal backgrounds, with policy backgrounds that obviously bring a lot to the rigour and authenticity of the UN in terms of the work that we do to ensure that we are operating off a sound knowledge and fact base. So there's lots of different roles and lots of different ways to work for the United Nations system itself. But the United Nations system has so many different avenues and different agencies. UNHCR looking at refugees, obviously, UN Women tasked with gender equality and women's empowerment, right through to UNICEF looking at women and children. So there are quite a few different, and then there's the World Food Programme, there's a range of other UN agencies. So I think it's find your passion point first and then explore really what UN agencies are doing within your own market and then globally, because I've certainly had the privilege of working both in a national role but also in a global role, working out of New York headquarters for about 7 or so years. And it's a very different environment than the one that I experienced working for the national office. But again, quite diverse. I would just encourage diversity of experience and look at all the different roles that are available through the UN, because they're not simply all cast within international development. Obviously, that's part of it, but there's economics, there's law, there's marketing, communications. There are many different ways and many different career paths and profiles within the UN system.
I wanted to compare it a little bit with maybe working at a multinational corporation or like just a company where maybe you can get into different roles and different and work in a corporate context. How would you say, of course, the UN is a mission-driven organization and focusing more on global policies and advancing human rights. How do you think that shapes the culture of the organization? How does that differ from maybe a corporate culture? And what kind of people really thrive in the UN?
That's a great question, and there was a lot in that. So let me just roll back a little bit to the starting point, which was, really around, I think, the diversity and the comparison between UN and private sector. I've had the opportunity to work on both sides of that sort of same fence, if you like, and I think fundamentally the world is seeing an absolute shift and has been for some time, both in terms of the growth of sustainability being core to for-profits and not-for-profits, and so there is a wonderful confluence of purpose, I think, whether you're in private sector or the United Nations system or working for an NGO. And so where the traditional view of corporations being there simply to churn out income, they are, of course, income generating and profit generating entities. But I think there is much more understanding of, and certainly within corporates, that they need to be more mindful of not only their operating context, but also their people. And I think if we look at what, is being termed as, the great resignation and the talent pool is dwindling, that competition for people, both in private sector and I think in not-for-profits, is increasing. And people are really wanting to hold on to their teams and their people. So I think it's really important to consider that when people look at the UN, they might think it's, incredibly different to the private sector or corporates and how they approach their work. But I think more and more there's really a merging of views and purpose. Obviously, some are for not-for-profit and some are for-profit. But I think at the end of the day, there's certainly a really strong component of purpose and impact coming through, whether you're in the private sector or the United Nations system. So that's really exciting. I remember when I started in my career very early on and people were talking about corporate social responsibility. And at the time I was very young and cynical, but my view was that, why would companies care about social responsibility and what's in it for them? And I think the reality is that, and increasingly over time, companies are just big groups of people. So whether you work in the UN system or in the private sector or wherever you work, humanity hopefully drives the agenda with mutual outcomes and objectives around generating income, giving back to communities, ensuring there's a license to operate. So I actually don't think there's as much difference perhaps now as there might have been in the past. Obviously, we have slightly different objectives and, we don't in the UN system work for profit. But the other sort of myth that I'd like to dispel really is this notion that, around not-for-profits, I much prefer to call organisations like United Nations committees, like what would be coined charities, as for-purpose organisations, because this myth that charities and not-for-profits exist not to make money is an absolute nonsense. We absolutely rely on generating income through the generosity and support of donors. And if we are not transparent in the way that we do that, and if we are not accountable to our donors, just as corporates are accountable to their customers, then we not only do ourselves a disservice, but we also go out of business. So most not-for-profits are actually independently funded. Some receive government funding, of course, for their programs. But I think there are some absolute similarities between the need and desire to be more cost-effective, to ensure the money it gets to where it's supposed to be, in terms of the not-for-profit space, and also, that mutuality of purpose. When we have healthy and thriving communities, we have successful businesses, and we have, support for our development programs, for all those programs that are actually working to address some of the biggest challenges we face as a human race. So I think it's really important to just focus on the fact that we're all in this together, and this notion that there are these sort of three sectors that operate in three different ways and in different worlds is, again, missing the point, because my experience has certainly been that cross-sector collaboration is absolutely the way that we will get long-lasting and systemic change, and that means all sectors. That means private sector, public sector, governments, not-for-profits, INGOs, NGOs, all of us working together.
And it's a good point around for-purpose organisations, but that support, that it is really for-purpose organisations that are trying to drive the rest of the world to make things better. And one of the things we've touched on in another podcast episode was around the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were released by the UN in 2015. And goal number 5 being gender parity. There's a McKinsey report that I'm going to refer to, which essentially lays out 10 things that we need to know about gender equity and how little progress we've made in gender equity from 2015 to 2019. And in their leadership positions ratio of female to male, we've only made a 0.02% increase in women in leadership roles across global organizations, which is quite frustrating, really, isn't it, in kind of 4 years? And obviously things have got worse since COVID.
Indeed they have, which is another setback. So while I completely agree that there have obviously been some significant gains in gender equality, there at the World Economic Forum obviously also puts out its reports. We have our own gender equality reports, and there is, the Gender Equality Index, which actually ranks countries on a range of indicators, some sort of 75 plus indicators, 56 indicators across 144 countries. And what the Gender Equality Index does is actually rank countries in order of their progression against those key indicators. So as you can imagine, that's an incredibly complex piece of work. Currently in 2021, Iceland was number 1 in terms of being closest to gender equality, followed closely by Finland and Norway. So in the top three in terms of gender equality in the world, you have Iceland, Finland, and then Norway. Unfortunately, Australia comes in at 50th on that ranking, which is pretty disappointing, and the US comes in at 38th. And that score is based on a number of indicators, as I mentioned, about 56 indicators across 144 countries. And the index actually tracks progress of about 135 of those countries against those indicators to determine each country's ranking. That's a really powerful tool, I think, both nationally and internationally, to be able to call out and to measure progress against the Sustainable Development Goals in particular, and in particular, as you mentioned, SDG number 5, which is all around gender equality, which is actually UN Women's reason for existence. To be perfectly honest, we are tasked with advancing, obviously, gender equality globally, but obviously with a range of partners and other key stakeholders. So, unfortunately, as you mentioned, COVID, we know, has had quite a devastating impact. At last count, the World Economic Forum, as of last year, called out that it would take us 135.6 years to reach gender equality. Prior to COVID, we were actually under 100 years. So in the space of 2 years, our progress towards gender equality has actually regressed or increased, if you like, by some 35 plus years. So you mentioned leadership is a really important part. And one of the things that UN Women works really closely on is to look at how we can empower more women to become leaders, both in terms of government, but also in terms of the workplace. And that doesn't always mean to necessarily be, the chief executive, but it certainly does mean that we need to ensure that there are talent pathways and progression opportunities for women. And so that's one of the things that we are looking at universally across the globe and working with women.
So the stats evidently are telling us, painting quite a dire picture to some extent. And organisations like the UN Women and there are various other organisations across Australia who are, and the government itself is trying to help repair some of that damage and move things in the right direction. As people, our audience generally is from a corporate background and generally are kind of in mid-level management or leadership positions. What kinds of things could we all fight for and do that would actually help more women get into the workforce? Is it things like maternity leave? Is it things like more flexible working? Like, have you guys got any research that demonstrates where some of these factors have a bigger impact than others?
Absolutely. And I think it also depends on, country to country. In Australia, for example, just last week we had the gender pay gap released, which was for the first time a comparison of women's salaries to men's, obviously, but also across every age group. And in every age group, men out-earn women. I suppose that's not as surprising. We probably all knew that. But the fact that, for example, millennial women working now in Australia in the workforce, by the time they are at 45, they will earn 70% of what a man earns, so 30% less than a man. And I think at a fundamental fairness basis, there is no rationale, logic, rhyme, nor reason why women doing the same job should get less money by sheer virtue of their gender. So there are various things that we can look at, that we ask employers to look at and consider. Firstly, it's things like you mentioned around support in terms of childcare. We need to look at gender neutral policies, flexible working environments, and also looking to redesign leadership. So the current construct that we have of leaderships is that it's basically full-time roles and predominantly male. Now, the reality is that most women, or a majority of women, at some stage in their life will either leave the workforce due to family considerations, childcare, and actually move to a part-time role. And some people will just opt out of the workforce altogether. The challenge with that is that there are not a lot of part-time management roles, for example, in Australia. So there's not a lot of opportunity for women to maintain their career progression while they are working part-time. So immediately they are put on the back foot. So in terms of career progression, in terms of opportunities, they're also often passed over for the fear that they may take time out to have children. So I think, this increase of paternity leave and this these discussions around men as caregivers as well is really important. There's a lot of men that are now, or more and more men now actually taking those paternity leave benefits that are being offered by the large corporates. And, that's really a game changer, because what those gender neutral policies will do is enable women to stay in the workforce if they choose to, and men to be the caregivers. So it's not about reducing the care for families, it's actually just swapping out those roles. And that's a really fundamental, it's quite simple thing to do. But again, we need those flexible work environments. We need to redesign the way we think about leadership and what that looks like, and then things like on-site childcare and other sort of family care supports. So I think those gender neutral policies and paternity leave are really important, because it also then reduces the stigma, if you like, or the perception that, well, what will happen when she goes off on maternity leave and when she takes a career break? And I was talking to a friend recently who said she is hoping also to start a family, but she is up for promotion. And I said, have you been able to talk to your reporting manager? She said, there's no way I can bring this up. She said, I work in construction and I'm already marginalised as a woman. And if they thought that I was going to, I was looking to have a family, that would work against me. She said, we often hear it doesn't, but we know it does. So that's tough for women. So there's a double impact there on women.
And I feel like that actually gives us a natural progression, right? Because that story really does hit a nerve with me, because something that you and I discussed prior was around kind of psychological safety at work. So creating an environment where anyone, regardless of whether you're a female, whether you're an LGBT, whether you're a man and you have mental health problems, or being able to bring your true self to work, all of those things wrap into this topic of psychological safety, which has been a bit of a hot topic. And Simone, I'd love to get your view on what is psychological safety at work, why is it important, and why should we all be talking about it?
Well, again, just to put a disclaimer out there that I'm not a psychologist with any formal training, but I do know from the work that we do, and certainly the lived experience, that for women in the workplace, there is a whole range of additional considerations around their psychological safety based on their gender. But again, it's not peculiar or unique just to women. I think you also brought out the point around LGBTQI and the conversation even around pronouns as a way of identifying to colleagues in an office environment, or when you're communicating, what your pronouns are, so that they feel comfortable, that others who don't share the same pronouns feel comfortable sharing theirs. So, in terms of psychological safety, I think it is still a lot about these stereotypes, and really looking at how we look at our unconscious bias and how do we actually change that. And I know there's been criticisms of things like unconscious bias training, but I think it's really important just to take a step out sometimes and look at how you think about the way you recruit. Look at how you, what are your perceptions about others in the workplace? And for us all just to almost be trained in challenging those many assumptions and those bias that we already have as human beings. And we all have bias, regardless of how unbiased we like to think we are. We bring bias from our gender, we bring it from our ethnicity, our cultural background, spirituality. So there's a whole range of things, and you'll probably hear a lot of conversation around intersectionality at the moment, which looks at a range of different factors that sort of overlap and create social identities. And some of them might be empowering, but some of them are also oppressive. So, for example, a woman of colour might face discrimination from a business that is not distinctly due to her is not distinctly, approving or open to her race, but also due to her gender. She's also, again, doubly marginalised. So there are things that intersect for each of us, which also play a role in how we are perceived, but also how we perceive others. And then by extension, how those biases are formed. I think it's important for organisations to have policies and training in place as well, but I also think it's very much an individual responsibility to challenge your own assumptions as often as you can. And I do. I fall into the habit of slipping into biases that I thought I didn't have, and then I realise, hang on a minute, that you do have a bias there and you need to check that. So I think it's, we often tend to look to, the workplace and businesses and corporations and employers to necessarily have all the answers. But we are all part of the workforce, and I think we also need to be incredibly mindful of how others are tracking around us and make sure that they feel safe in the workplace or in a team.
It makes such a big difference to creating an inclusive environment and making people feel like they can be themselves and perform to the best of their abilities. In fact, safety is, according to Maslow's hierarchy, one of the basic human needs. It's right up near food and shelter. The next thing is safety. And so for people not just to feel physically safe, but to feel psychologically safe, it's a very important thing for people to be able to bring their best self to work. And I suppose I wanted to go more into what are some examples where you've seen organizations implement an effective program to manage unconscious bias and promote psychological safety, because we hear of so many examples where there is, very toxic work culture, and the typical example might be at, one of those bro culture type companies. We've heard of Uber and sort of the toxic corporate work environment where different leaders were alleged of sexual harassment, and that led to a huge turn in terms of the percentage of women who worked at the company and the type of and the productivity of the environment, and just created a very bad reputation of Uber as an employer. But what are some companies that are maybe doing it right and that we can learn from?
I think you're absolutely correct when we talk about there are corporate cultures that are toxic. But when I look at the corporate culture, I think a lot of the time we say, well, what's the company doing about it? But what are we doing about it? That toxic culture doesn't exist if every individual in that team and organisation called out what they saw, called out misogyny or bad behaviour. We say you can't be what you can't see in terms of, empowering young women to, and for more leadership for young girls and women in the workforce. But similarly, if racism and misogyny and discrimination and all those awful biases that individuals have, if they are called out and if they are not evident, then the whole point of unconscious bias goes away. And I think for a certain amount, you can certainly create policies in workplaces. You can do your best as a corporate leader to ensure that those policies are upheld. But again, I call out everybody, every individual. The unconscious biases exist at an individual level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I reflect on my situation because I work in a startup environment, and the leadership makes such a big difference. If the leaders are bought in and understand how important it is to tackle these issues and really make sure that everyone in the company is able to feel included and feels safe at work, and is able to understand the concept of bias and act on it, then it really makes a difference. And also, the diversity at the leadership level as well talks a lot about, how prepared the organization is to take steps towards, or well, not even how prepared it is, but how well it shows the rest of the world we are a diverse environment, and we want different types of people to thrive in our company because our leaders are like that. So it really does come down to the leadership.
Absolutely. And, leaders have to play an absolute role. I'm not absolutely not discounting that. And it absolutely is the role of leadership to ensure that everyone feels included and welcome and part of a team. Absolutely. And to understand the biases that do exist and their own biases. So I completely agree with you that it is absolutely paramount for leadership. And I think your comment about, the composition of leadership, if you only see middle-aged white Anglo-Saxon men in leadership roles, then that's what we then by default assume is the norm. And those who don't fit that mold, who aren't recruited, it would assume that they aren't valued in those roles. So this is where we need more women in leadership roles. It's where we need more diversity in all roles. because, I think I was talking to someone the other day about superannuation in Australia and the fact that superannuation, when it was built back in the 70s, when it was designed predominantly for men, because in the 70s, the workforce was predominantly male. Well, that's all well and good, but now if you fast forward 30 or 40 years, the nature, the shape, the diversity of our workforce in whatever country you are is changing, and it's changing significantly. The way we work, the number of women in the workforce is increasing day by day. So we need to also ensure that that diversity is representative in the workplace, in the culture, and certainly in the leadership. And we know that businesses with more women in leadership roles are more profitable. Their culture improves as well. And so, there are so many data points you can call out about the value of having more women and more diverse people in leadership, but also across the board in the workforce. Because I know, for example, in STEM and tech, a lot of women have a really hard time staying in roles because it is predominantly male. I'm not saying that all the men aren't, lovely men, but the culture that often exists in that environment is not a culture that one woman out of 10 men necessarily feels comfortable in. So, there's so many considerations to take into account, but certainly the diversity of leadership, the diversity of the workforce, and certainly the policies to support that diversity is absolutely why we've seen such a rise in diversity and inclusion roles and methodologies over the last 20 to 25 years, because we simply have to, because otherwise we're not shaping and morphing business to meet the demographics of our workforce.
And Simone, I think that brings us to time on the podcast, which is such a shame. I feel like I could talk about these topics all day.
I know, right?
I know. Trisha, I don't know if you had any other questions that you wanted to ask before we...
No, all good. I think we've covered it.
Fab.
Okay.
Simone, I'd just like to thank you for taking the time out this morning. I loved the conversation. It was really good. And I hope that it was hopefully positive and not just a moan from every one of us.
I feel like I'm moaning all the time, so it was fairly upbeat for me. But yes, the thing is, we're facing some pretty big, hairy goals here, and there's a lot to fix. So it does sometimes feel like you're sliding down the slope, but there are things we can do. So I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of takeaways for people, particularly our audience, to actually take away and think about going into their own organisation. So I think when we do the marketing on the episode, I think there's a lot that we can draw out from this one. Don't forget to check out our more recent episodes where we connect with global female CEOs to explore how to make it to the top. Whether your ambition is to be an executive at a corporate, build a franchise, or pivot your traditional career, check us out. Be sure to give us a like or follow on LinkedIn, TikTok, or Instagram at Lattes With Leaders. Our mission is to hear the voices of women from around the world. So if you're an avid listener and want your voice heard through our platform, please reach out.